right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's a really special occasion as we, here at the National Constitution Center, celebrate the 150th anniversary of congressional approval of the 14th Amendment, which enshrined equality in our Constitution. I can't really think of a better way of reflecting on the values enshrined in that particular provision than the program we have here tonight. Before we begin, would you please join me in a moment of silence in remembrance of the lives taken from us this past weekend in Orlando. Thank you very much. So my name is Tom Donnelly. I'm actually the new Senior Fellow for Constitutional Studies here at the National Constitution Center. So if you haven't seen me yet, I've done a couple of our programs, but I look forward to getting to know everyone in the weeks and months ahead. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program featuring civil rights icon Jim Obergefell and Debbie Cenziper of the Washington Post and their new book. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a moment to say thank you to our members and especially to the leadership support of our 1787 Society donors joining us here today. We really appreciate everything that you do for the center. If you have any questions or would like more information about membership at the National Constitution Center, which includes invitations to exclusive exhibit openings, free museum admission, and discounted admission for town hall programs, please see Rebecca at the membership table in the Kirby lobby. And just so you know, our spring and summer town hall season is winding down, and it's been so many great programs. Many of the programs that are coming up are sold out, but there are still at least two where we still have some tickets available. The first is entitled Abortion and the Constitution, What You Need to Know. And here we're bringing together some of the best thinkers and advocates across the ideological spectrum to talk about this very important issue. Including Clark Forsyth, the Senior Counsel for Americans United for Life, Mary Ziegler, a legal historian at Florida State and author of the book After Roe, and Catherine Colbert, professor of political science at Barnard College, who argued on behalf of the petitioners in the historic case Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The second program is entitled, appropriately enough, The Presidency of George Washington, focusing on the presidency of George Washington. It'll take place during the week of the Democratic National Convention, and it really has a pair of just dynamite scholars in Yale's Akil Reed Amar and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Joseph Ellis, and the conversation between the two of them should really sizzle and create, I think, a great historical context for that historic week here in Philadelphia. So please visit our website to purchase tickets at constitutioncenter.org if you're interested in either of those programs or just to find out what's coming up at the center. Lastly, and most importantly, please take a moment right now to silence your cell phones. Now, just to introduce our guests here tonight, really just three dynamite speakers. First is Jim Obergefell, who was the named plaintiff in the landmark Supreme Court case last term, Obergefell versus Hodges. And so that case obviously dealing with marriage equality and the 14th Amendment. And following the Supreme Court's landmark ruling last year in that case, Jim's embraced a career as a public speaker and continued his work as an advocate with organizations like the Human Rights Campaign and Equality Ohio. Foreign Policy Magazine named Jim one of its 2015 Global Thinkers, and Out Magazine named Jim to its 2015 Out 100 list. And then joining Jim is Debbie Cenziper. She's with the Washington Post. She joined the Washington Post's investigative staff after working at the Miami Herald for more than 5 years. And so while at the Herald, she actually received the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for local reporting for her year-long investigation of housing corruption in Miami. And while at the Post, she's also been awarded Harvard University's 2009 Goldsmith Prize for investigative reporting for a series called Forced Out, which exposed dangerous conditions in the District of Columbia's rent-controlled apartments. So today, Debbie and Jim are going to discuss their newly released book, Love Wins, The Lovers and Lawyers Who Fought the Landmark Case for Marriage Equality. And just so you know, they will be signing copies downstairs after the program. There will also be a book sale down there, so please go down and enjoy that. And so moderating tonight's program is award-winning justice correspondent for NPR, Carrie Johnson. She covers a wide variety of stories about justice issues, law enforcement, and legal affairs for NPR's flagship programs, Morning Edition, and All Things Considered. Carrie will be taking questions from the audience towards the end of the discussion. So if you have a question, please jot it down on one of the note cards that will be handed out, and one of the members of the staff will pick it up and bring it up to the stage. So at this point, please join me in giving a warm National Constitution Center welcome to Carrie Johnson, Jim Obergefell, and Debbie Cenziper.
Thank you so much. What an enthusiastic crowd. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about this book. And Jim, I want to ask you to start. How does it feel to be a household name, even if not everybody can pronounce your name?
Well, I think you probably got an indication of how that feels to me during Tom's introduction when he called me a civil rights icon, and I just kind of laughed. It doesn't feel possible that people call me that. It doesn't feel possible that I'm in this place. You're right, I do chuckle thinking about all of those law students who are going to have to learn how to spell and pronounce Obergefell. But it's still a surreal thing to me. It doesn't feel possible. I don't think it's really sunk in. But all I can say is, John and I stood up for each other. We fought for each other and for people across the country. And for me, the most amazing thing is to have been able to create a legacy in honor and in memory of my husband, and to help make our country a better place. So regardless of what people call me or how they feel about me, all I know is I did what was right and we helped make a difference.
Debbie, one of the things in this book that really struck me was a sentence that you wrote. Some of the most successful civil rights cases have started with a story. How did that inform how you decided to tell this story?
Well, we knew early on that this was a human interest story. This was a story about love and commitment and family, and what spouses do to protect each other, what parents do to protect their children. And I think this case in particular really resonated with the American public because the lawyers did tell beautiful stories about plaintiffs that we could all relate to. And every civil rights case going back for years they've been successful because the plaintiffs were people that they were our neighbors, our friends. They were people that we could relate to.
Jim, as so beautifully depicted in the book, you lived a quiet life, and then in the waning days of your husband's life, after more than 20 years together, you decided to sign on to a court case. What had been your experience prior to that with the law, with the courts, and how did you think about them, if at all?
We really didn't. We had very little experience with the court system. I mean, I was on jury duty twice. Does that count? But very little experience, and I think our opinion was very similar to the opinion so many people across the country have of the legal profession, of attorneys, and it's not always positive. I'm not saying that's how we felt, but I think we all pick up on that in our culture. So no experience whatsoever, but meeting our attorney, Al Gerhardstein, and having him knock on our door and introduce himself, and just understanding and being able to tell so clearly that he was incredibly intelligent, humble, kind, and on our side, it was an easy decision to make. Even outside of all of the other reasons, the fact that it was Al and he is the person he is, it was an easy decision to make.
And nowadays, are you in touch with lawyers and law and the courts all the time? Do you see yourself as some kind of expert?
Absolutely not. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm an expert because from the plaintiff's perspective, but I'm absolutely not an expert in the law. I certainly talk to a lot of attorneys, a lot of law students. I've spoken at several law schools. Without fail, when I speak somewhere, there are always law students who come up to me and tell me, we just learned about your case. I can't believe I'm actually meeting the named plaintiff in a case I'm learning about. So I do have a lot of interaction with attorneys and with students, and I've spoken at several continuing education law programs, but I'm absolutely not an expert in law. I don't want to be an expert in law. That's why there are attorneys.
Talk a little bit, if you could, Jim, about your husband's wishes for you and for this case.
Well, John, he was one of the most generous, thoughtful, witty people I've ever known, and incredibly well-spoken. And from the moment we became a couple, he was always the one who was looking out for me, looking out for others. It was never about him. And when he was diagnosed with ALS, his concern from the get-go was about me. Everything he thought about, everything he proposed, everything we did because he was thinking about me. You know, I think when he was first diagnosed and we were living in a 2-story condo in a building that wasn't very handicap friendly, and he said, we need to find a new place. And when we buy that new place, Jim, my name will not be on the deed. It should be only in your name because I want to help you avoid any possible issues that could happen. And when we met Al, this was another moment where he brought this up. You know, we discussed it. Al came over. We talked about it. Then John and I talked about it, and he said, well, I absolutely think filing this suit is the right thing to do, but I want you to understand, and I want you to be okay with this. It will all be on you, Jim, because I can't do anything. But I know for him, saying, yes, let's do this, and let's put our lives in the public arena, was his way of living up to his promises to love, honor, and protect me. But more importantly for him, from the moment he was diagnosed, he felt like he had ruined my life. And he apologized over and over for ruining my life. So agreeing to do this and agreeing to be in the public eye, and for John to have pictures of him in a hospital bed or in a wheelchair, that was a very difficult thing for him to do. But it was his way to say thank you to me.
Debbie, you talk in the book a lot about the idea that the legal strategy here was at first to go very modest, to go very small. And eventually, through the course of the book, it becomes an historic event. Mm-hmm. How did you shape that in the writing? How did you hear from the lawyers who devised this strategy where they wanted to go?
So as you know, there were lawyers from 4 states involved in the case that eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. I chose to focus heavily on the lawyer from Ohio, Al Gerhardstein, who is this scrappy local civil rights lawyer who has spent 30-some years fighting for the rights of women and the gay community and other people who were disenfranchised. And you're right, Al started small, and so did the lawyers in the other states. Al decided to work on one case, a death certificate case, because if you don't, I think most of you probably already know, Jim's husband was dying of ALS, and the state of Ohio refused to recognize their marriage. And that meant that when John died, he would be given a death certificate that listed him as single, and Jim's name wouldn't be on it as the surviving spouse. So Al seized on a very practical, tangible problem, and he took that first case to court, and from there he took on another case just like it, and then he expanded his case to include same-sex married couples who adopted a baby at birth from Ohio, or who had children in Ohio, but Ohio wouldn't give those babies a birth certificate that listed the names of both their parents. Ohio basically said to the parents, you choose, only one of your names can go on the birth certificate, and the other would have to be a legal stranger to this child, which is just outrageous. And so what Al did is he built it one example at a time, one couple at a time, and eventually that made its way to the Supreme Court. But there were, as I said, lawyers in 3 other states doing very similar things.
Including one who's here tonight.
Yes, I think we have someone, if we can
Regina,
embarrass her.
are you
Tell
here?
her to stand. This is Regina Lambert in the back row, one of the lawyers in the case. sorry to embarrass you, but one of the Tennessee lawyers who represented a number of same-sex parents who were just trying to get their names on a birth certificate. Again, very tangible problem. And I think that because the problems were just so outrageous and so just, how can this happen? How can a state deny a baby an accurate birth certificate? I think that that spoke to all of us, including those of us who are not members of the gay community.
Well, in fact, Debbie, you talk about a lawyer for the state of Ohio who was assigned to defend Ohio's position, who privately harbored a lot of doubts about Ohio's position.
Not just doubts, she believed in same-sex marriage. You're exactly right. I mean, this is one of the most compelling characters, I think, in the book is Bridget Coons, who was an assistant attorney general in Ohio. Her boss was Mike DeWine, who I bet is a familiar name to many of you. And Mike DeWine had publicly said he did not believe in same-sex marriage, and the voters of Ohio had embedded in the state's constitution a ban on same-sex marriage, but not just on same-sex marriage, but even on the recognition of same-sex marriages legally performed in other states. And so Bridget Coons was suddenly told she had to defend this marriage ban in federal court, even though she personally believed in same-sex marriage. And one of my favorite scenes in the book is Bridget Coons saying she went into court and wanted to say Bridget Coons on behalf of the wrong side of this courtroom. But she had a duty to defend the law, and she did it, and it was a very difficult thing. And I think you sensed that when you were in court.
I did. Sitting in the courtroom when we left that day, I forget who I said it to, but I turned to someone and said, you know what? I honestly feel like Bridget was the last one who came into the office that day, and that was how they chose who had to argue it. Because I sensed, I sensed that her heart wasn't in it.
Yeah, and in fact, when the birth certificate plaintiffs went to federal court, Bridget's colleague argued, Bridget was her supervisor, but her colleague was 9 months pregnant at the time, arguing against giving birth certificates that were accurate to a number of same-sex couples who were sitting in the jury box. And it was a very uncomfortable thing for them.
One other point that you draw out in this book is that a number of federal judges had interesting personal experiences, which informed their views about this case. One, Martha Daughtry, asked the question in the course of argument. It took women 80 years to fulfill their right to vote. Is it going to take 80 years for people like Jim to get their rights?
Yeah, and her point in saying that is, you can't wait on hearts and minds of voters. If there's a constitutional right at stake, you can't wait for the democratic process. You have to move forward. And one of the things I'm most proud of about this book is that we were able to get 2 sitting federal judges to describe their experiences and how they felt. In fact, the first judge, Judge Tim Black, is a federal judge in Cincinnati who first ruled in John and Jim's favor and eventually ruled in favor of the same-sex couples who wanted accurate birth certificates for their children. He and his wife adopted a baby at birth years and years ago, and every day on their little girl's adoption day, they sang a folk song to her called Oh Happy Adoption Day. And at the end of his 48-page decision overturning Ohio's ban on the recognition of same-sex marriages, at the very end of that 48-page decision, he put the words of that song in there. And so even judges had a very, personal perspective here.
Well, and he also held that decision until her adoption day.
So he released the ruling in your case?
No, not on my case, on the birth certificate case. He released that ruling on her adoption day.
Yeah.
The law is about people.
It's
Yes.
the laws about people.
Well, and that's been one of the common themes, every time I'm out in public and I meet attorneys especially, they always say, you know what, you were such a great plaintiff. Your story, yours and John's story was such a great story. You made the perfect plaintiff, whatever that means. But I hear over and over again about how this case, John's and my story, the stories of the other 30-some plaintiffs on our case, it was all about people. It was about real people facing real issues. And we made it real, we made it relatable, we made it connectable to people across the country. Because every case, there are people at the heart of it. And I think for a lot of us in the country, when we hear about law cases, our eyes glaze over because we think it's just about these arcane points of law. And our entire team took pains to make sure that every step of the way, we were front and center. They made pains to make sure that people knew this was about people. This was not about some arcane point of law. And that made a difference.
Well, in your case, as Debbie put it so beautifully, in death, you would have been a stranger on your husband's birth certificate. You would have been unrecognized, your 20-year commitment to each other.
Exactly. And I'll give you an example of why a very real impact that had. John's grandparents bought a cemetery plot in Cincinnati. And when they bought that back in the 30s or 40s, they added a provision that said only direct descendants and their legally married spouses could be buried or memorialized on that plot. John's mom, when she passed away, John went to the cemetery and said, I want her here, or a plaque for her, and I want to reserve this spot next to her for her boyfriend of 18 years at the time. So the cemetery looked up the documents and said, nope, sorry, he can't be there because his mom and her boyfriend weren't married. We forgot about that until we got married and until we met Al and we decided to do this. And in fact, we didn't even remember it right away. About 2 weeks later, it popped into John's memory. So that was a very real thing for us. If we wanted to be memorialized together, where we had been every day for the past 21 years almost, we weren't able to do it. Not in his family plot where he wanted to be memorialized.
And
so that's a
how
very real harm.
outrageous is that? It's almost punitive, really. As an outsider looking in, it really seems punitive. Who does it hurt? Why would it have hurt anyone to recognize John and Jim's marriage? Why would it have hurt to give parents birth certificates for their babies that listed the names of both parents? It really seemed almost punitive.
We alluded to this a little bit earlier, but some of the objections that you faced in the courts and these cases combined faced in the courts came from judges who said, let the voters decide this, not a group of federal judges. Let the voters decide this or there's going to be a backlash.
That came up every single step of the way. In our first hearing, in the birth certificate hearing, at the appeals court, at the Supreme Court. And whenever that came up, I always thought back to what Al said, our attorney said in our very first hearing when that came up. And I will paraphrase. He said, the surest way to abridge the constitutional rights of a minority is to allow the majority to vote on it. And this wait-and-see attitude, I never quite understood it. Even in our first hearing, the state kept saying, well, if John Arthur dies, if John dies. And the judge even had to step in and say, there's no if about this. He will die. And to take a wait-and-see attitude, that was causing harm. And I was always taught that the court system is where our civil rights, our constitutional rights are protected when laws and when other people are not giving those to us. So my opinion was we were in the exact right place to be. And why wait? It wasn't fair to us. It wasn't fair to couples like us.
This movement has come so far in the last 10 or 15 years alone. It's been a remarkable trajectory. And still, just a few days ago, we had this horrible massacre in Orlando. And of all places, a gay nightclub on Latin night. And the role of nightclubs in the gay community is a special thing.
It really is. Gay clubs where we could go and feel safe, be around people like us, be around people who weren't going to judge us, who weren't going to demean us. That was, for a lot of people in the LGBTQ community, that was the only safe place they had in their world. It was a place we could go, be ourselves, celebrate, be with people who were like us or who supported us. And this horrible atrocity has destroyed that sense of safety. I think about our transgender community. They have become the targets of the backlash. I think with marriage equality, we knew there'd be a backlash. Certainly never expected it to be so vicious. And the opponents of equality, they've realized changing attitudes, changing laws, the LGB part of our community, they've realized in a lot of ways that we're winning. We haven't won, but we are winning. And they realized, oh, well, the T part of that community, let's go after them because they don't seem to have quite as much power, quite as many rights, or quite as much anything as the rest of the community. And they are targeting them. And it's simply wrong. And now the rest of the community, the LGB part of it, we've always had a sense of fear, but it's muted over the past several years. Well, it's back in full force. And I now feel a little bit, and I will say a little bit, I feel a little bit of the fear that I can only imagine our transgender family does.
That segs into some of the work that you're doing now. You won your fight, but the fight is not done for everybody.
Not at all. It really surprised me how frequently after the decision going around the country, people would say, oh, you know what, the gay rights movement is done. You have marriage. There's nothing more to do. And there is so much education that has to be done, and that's up to all of us in the community. It's up to our allies. It's up to people to explain, no, our fight is not done, because in far too many places across the country, a couple who exercises that constitutional right to marry, if they put up a photo at work, they post something on Facebook, well, the very next day they could lose their job. They could lose their home. So we have not won. Yes, we won a big victory, and we were right to celebrate that, but we still have so much more work to do. And this horrible massacre in Orlando is clear evidence that there's still so much animus towards our community, and we are targeted.
Jim, it's so powerful to hear you talk about that. I mean, you're a guy who was at the White House a week or two ago. The president calls you on the phone sometimes. He mispronounces your name, but at least he calls you on the phone. But it speaks to how potent this is still.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how prominent or how seemingly powerful any member of our community is. We are all still at risk. We are all still targets. We are targeted by certain members, certain areas of our fellow citizens, and that shouldn't happen. That isn't what America's about. John and I, the other plaintiffs in this case, the attorneys in this case, we all fought for 4 important words that are inscribed in the pediment of that Supreme Court building: equal justice under law. We are Americans, and we deserve that equal justice. We deserve the same feeling of, we deserve the same life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that every other American does. And until everybody in this nation can accept that and live that, we have work to do. And until every kid can grow up feeling safe, loved, and able to be who they are without fear and without apology, we have work to do.
Debbie, you've told so many brilliant stories over the years. Why did you want and need to tell this story?
I've wanted to write a book for a long time, but I was busy doing Washington Post stories, and honestly, I never really found a subject that I wanted to write about, and this just moved me. I mean, this story, like so many other people, it moved me. I could not believe that couples faced these kinds of problems. I mean, I'd always heard of the issue of marriage equality, and I, of course, bought into it, I understood it. This was real. I mean, this was people who were able to get married, and they couldn't protect their families. And as a mother, I just couldn't believe that was happening. There are so many problems in the world and in our own backyards, and this is what we have a problem with. The plaintiffs in this book are people who live in cul-de-sacs, they drive minivans, they find the best schools for their kids, they schlep diaper bags around. I mean, these are, people that are friends, neighbors, family members, and their stories just really moved me, and in fact, changed me. They really did as a person and as a journalist. I've been writing about bad people for so long, bad people who do bad things, and this is a story about love and law, and it really, really changed me in a lot of ways.
You had a bit of a personal connection that tied you two together.
We had a loose family connection. In fact, John and Jim were at my wedding 25 years ago.
Really? Yes.
But it's a loose family connection because John and Jim stayed together, but I did not stay with my first husband. Much stronger in this, really, than the heterosexual person on the stage. But it's interesting, and what I remember about John and Jim from 25 years ago, we really didn't keep in touch. Our lives were going in different directions. Was I come from a family, parents who happened to be politically very conservative. I would say super conservative. And I remember my father standing at the bar, shooting back drinks with John and Jim, 25 years ago. And I was thinking, I don't know if he knows they're gay or not, or like, what's my father thinking? But that's how charming you guys were, and still, that's what I remember most.
I love that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if there's something else this audience should be looking forward to, and that's a movie that is being developed based on your story.
Yes, amazingly enough, last summer, we had our proposal ready to go on decision day, and it went out to publishers.
On decision day?
Right.
Within 30 minutes
Yes.
of the decision. Hit the streets in New York.
And even before we sold the book, we sold the movie rights to the book.
Before the book was written, which is a leap of faith on.
And before the book was written.
And a lot of pressure, a lot of pressure. Yeah.
So it still amazes me that happened, but the publisher, the producers, the studio, they all saw in this a story that was worth telling, a story of love, but a story of love wrapped within a legal thriller. And with the changes in our country, they just recognized and realized, this is really a watershed moment in our nation's history. And they snapped it up, which the thought of being involved in a movie and seeing myself portrayed on screen, it's really kind of freaky.
All right, Jim, who is going to play you in this movie, and who's going to play John?
It's so weird when people ask me that question, especially for me. It's really hard for me to think about who would portray me on screen, so I'll come back to that. For John, I've had a few ideas. Well, I've always thought Edward Norton. David Tennant, and I also think, and I just blanked on his name, I can't believe I did it, he played Stephen Hawking. Oh, right. Eddie Redmayne, but I'm not sure he necessarily wants to be known as the ALS actor. So, for me, the most important thing with any of the casting is that it's the best actors possible, the actors who can bring heart and meaning and soul to these roles. Now for me, I don't know. People have suggested James Franco, Michael Fassbender, Matt Damon, George Clooney, Brad Pitt. But for me, when I think about it, I can't seriously think about it. So I always think, okay, well, if this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. If I'm going to be portrayed on screen, well, of course I want to be hot. So I always think Matt Bomer.
Oh.
Yeah.
Suits. It would work.
Yes.
Yeah. He'd have to wear the bow tie.
White collar, yep.
Yeah. There are so many things in this book that are real, but also cinematic, such as the notion, Jim, when you showed up at the court, not knowing it was going to be your decision day, you got a slip of paper with a very special color on it.
Yes. So when I was in DC for oral arguments on April 28th, and then when I started going back to DC in mid-June of last year, people recommended go to DC, be there every possible decision day starting mid-June. So I was in that courtroom for 5 decision days. So the decision days leading up to the June 26th, as well as that oral argument day, when I would get to the courthouse and take my place in the public line for spectators, they would hand out tickets, and the tickets were bright orange every single one of those days. Well, the week of June 22nd, when they added Friday, June 26th, as a decision day, that was the first time we all started to think, oh, this might be it, because June 26th, kind of an important day in the gay rights movement, got there that morning and took my place in line, and we were chatting because there were a lot of people who were there every day, so we got to know each other. And the police officer came by, handed out the tickets, and we all just keep talking. No one else said anything, and no one else noticed anything, but I happened to look down at my ticket, and I noticed something was different. And I held it up to everyone. I said, did you guys notice something new today? Every other day it had been orange. That day the ticket was lavender. Thought, well, June 26th, lavender ticket. What could that possibly mean?
And you were right, and you were right.
Yes.
Jim, and Debbie too, the words in this ruling, in your case, have been used by couples, gay and straight, in their marriage ceremonies. What does that mean to you?
Well, I love it. I mean, it's that last page of his decision. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. And I've had the chance to read that in a double wedding in Cincinnati, a gay couple and a lesbian couple. And I love that people use that. They see the beauty in those words. They understand the meaning behind those words. And it speaks to them. It speaks to the importance of marriage. It speaks to the importance of committing yourself to another person. And I have to say, one of the best things I've experienced and I've realized over the past year, I feel like I'm part of thousands and thousands of marriages across this nation. And what a wonderful gift to me. You know, I lost my husband. I fought for my husband. I fought for our marriage. I fought for people across the country. And that simple gift of feeling like I'm part of all of those marriages, it's indescribable how nice that feels.
We've talked a little bit about what's next for you. Debbie, what's next for you after this?
Definitely a second book.
Yeah?
Definitely a second book.
Are you thinking more law, more legal thriller?
I'm not sure yet. I'm thinking about a couple different things. Yeah, well, I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure. I'll be back at the Washington Post, too. Yeah. Just wrote a big story in the Post about offshore tax havens. So
A little bit different.
Literally, that is why I want to write a second book. Trust me.
I think we're opening up for questions shortly. Oh, yeah. I guess I have one more question, which is this. Jim, you talked a little bit about things yet to be done. And we've had this movement in North Carolina, and now North Carolina, several other states, and the Justice Department are suing each other over new restrictions on transgender people. Do you feel as if, in your heart, that that matter is going to wind up right back where your case was resolved at the Supreme Court?
I do. I really do. And I think about it from this perspective, and I take it back, much like in the case for marriage equality, Loving v. Virginia. Back when that case was in court, and the states that made marriage between races illegal, it was always based, or an argument was based on religion. And the same thing with these laws that have been popping up. It's all around saying, well, for my religious freedom, I deserve the right to deny service to someone. I deserve the right to not allow them into my business. I deserve the right to not issue a marriage license. And now it's becoming really directed towards the transgender community. And it's all cloaked in the guise of religious freedom. What I don't understand is how, based on our history, anyone can claim that and think there's any possible reason that can stand. And what I wish people would understand is when you say, I want my religion to impact the laws, I want my religion to impact the civil rights or the civil liberties or the constitutional rights of another person, the person who is demanding that, that person is the one who is not living up to the Religious Freedom Amendment of the Constitution. So yes, I think it will end up in the Supreme Court, and there have been plenty of decisions, or several decisions, that say this is a matter of gender equality. So we are absolutely headed that way, and it is a matter of great importance in our country. I mean, we are all Americans. We all deserve the same rights, and yeah, we're headed that way. I absolutely think so.
We got a number of great questions from the audience. We're going to try to get through many of them. Do you believe there's value to making LGBT sexual orientation, gender identity a protected class for legal purposes?
Absolutely. And for me, when I think about how far we've come and where we have to go, the single thing we can do to have the most widespread impact is to update the 1964 Civil Rights Amendment. The Equality Act, which has been proposed, in which certain legislators continually refuse to even consider, that is the greatest single thing we can do. And that would add gender identity and sexual orientation to that civil rights bill, or civil rights amendment.
Another question related, what's it going to take to get that law passed? What do you think?
I hope one of the, and it even stuns me to say silver lining, but I hope one of the learnings from this horrible atrocity in Orlando is that it opens some lawmakers' eyes, and they understand what threat we are under, and they understand that our civil rights, our civil liberties are under attack. And it takes education as well. I think about our story. Our story resonated with people. People connected to it. The stories of all of my fellow plaintiffs, people related to those. And we took, for a lot of people, what was an abstract concept: a gay couple, a same-sex married couple, a gay couple or a lesbian couple with children. We took what were abstract concepts and we made them real. We let them get to know us. And that's how we make positive change in this country, is telling stories, letting people understand we are no different. So that's part of it, and we simply need people to vote. We need to get off our rear ends and go to that ballot box. We need to remember our elected officials who stand in the way of equality, our elected officials who treat people as less than, and we need to remember that in the ballot box. And we need to vote, because if we don't vote, not a whole lot's going to change.
Thank you and your husband for all you have done. Your commitment to marriage equality made my life and my family's life better. Did you ever consider getting married in Canada?
No, and that really goes back to, we talked about marriage quite a few times over our almost 21 years together, but we never wanted to do it until it actually carried legal weight. So we could have gone to multiple states over the years and gotten married, but it wasn't until the Windsor decision on June 26, 2013, striking down part of the Defense of Marriage Act, that the US federal government finally said, yes, you exist. We will recognize same-sex marriages that are lawfully performed in those states. So that was the moment we decided to get married, because finally our government would recognize us. So we never thought about Canada, but it wasn't anything against Canada. I love Canada. We wouldn't have gone anywhere until we actually had that some legal recognition.
Debbie, Justice Scalia's dissent in this case said it should have been decided in state houses, not the judicial system. Had that turned out to be the majority opinion, what do you think would happen next?
Well, first of all, that argument is a valid legal argument. As you know, constitutional lawyers and scholars debate the rights of states and whether the federal government or the judiciary should somehow step in, and overturn something that's decided by voters in the state. So it is a valid legal argument. That being said, when this case went to the Supreme Court, it was perfect timing, because every reputable poll by CNN, The Washington Post, and others found a majority of Americans loved and supported the gay community and believed in marriage equality. So the Supreme Court's decision wasn't altogether surprising because the American public was behind it. So I don't know what would have happened if it were sent back, but I know that there was a lot of support for marriage equality at that time.
Maybe not 80 years, but some more years.
Yeah.
Huh? Justice Scalia appears to be on the minds of the audience. Jim, at the Supreme Court, did you and the late Justice Scalia exchange a wave or glances?
No. I mean, really, especially for oral arguments, I was sitting in a different part of the courtroom than the other plaintiffs because I was there for the entire 2.5-hour session. The other plaintiffs had to decide if they wanted to be there for the hour-and-a-half arguments for the right to marry or the hour for the right to recognition. So they were in a separate spot. So I was somewhat anonymous, which was nice. And on decision day, I don't remember any justice appearing to look at me, but I can be pretty clueless. So maybe they were, but absolutely never once have I looked at, caught the eye of, met Justice Scalia or any of them. So, in fact, I just remember from oral arguments, Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas. I remember doing this in my chair quite a bit in oral arguments because I'd look at the bench, I'd see Justice, 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 blank space, Justice, Justice, Justice. Clarence Thomas leans all the way back. And I couldn't see him over the bench. So I definitely have never exchanged glances with him.
Jim, what LGBT groups gave you the most support? Meg wants to know. Megan.
The ACLU joined our case within a couple of weeks of filing. And then when we became partnered in the consolidated case with the birth certificate case, Lambda Legal. So those two organizations provided so much assistance, so much support, so much legal knowledge. They were fantastic. And I did a lot with the Human Rights Campaign. I've done a lot with Equality Ohio. And that was more, they weren't necessarily providing, especially Human Rights Campaign, they weren't providing assistance for the legal fight. They were providing assistance to kind of help me get through it. And they made it easier for me to be in DC all those times, to make sure I was in the courtroom, and they saw value in absolutely in this case, of course, and for some reason they thought I was a good person to help support. But that was purely from more of like a social media and appearance type of thing as opposed to legal.
Making a slight turn here toward November. Debbie, one of the audience members wants to welcome you back home to Philadelphia.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you. 5 generations are here, yeah.
And also wonders if you have thoughts on Donald Trump revoking the Washington Post press credentials.
Oh my. I think our executive editor put out a pretty sternly worded statement on that. I mean, you know, you can't kick out the Washington Post or any other media outlet because you don't like what they have to say. I mean, it is a free press, and there are definitely legitimate concerns about his attitude toward the media. But that's probably all I'd say on that question. It's a good one.
Staying in November for both of you, Omid Feruzi, I think, a Villanova law student, thank you. Do you fear a rollback of LGBT legal protections if a Republican president wins and appoints a string of conservative judges?
Absolutely. You know, pretty much every single GOP candidate said that day one, they would reverse every single executive order that President Obama issued to protect and support the LGBTQ community. Every single one of them, and with the exception of one, and it pains me to say this, John Kasich, the governor of my state, he was the only one who did not say he would do everything he could to overturn marriage equality. Every single other candidate, including Donald Trump, has said that they would appoint judges who would be opposed to marriage equality and who would overturn it. So absolutely, it scares the daylights out of me to think of a Republican in the White House because they have all said they will attempt to turn back every single bit of progress we have made.
The Supreme Court, though, Debbie, has now in more than one decision established marriage as a fundamental right in so many ways.
That's very true. I mean, this was the biggest, but there were a whole series of decisions that led up to this. But clearly, the Supreme Court is in limbo right now. I mean, everything is up in the air, and it's definitely an interesting time. Not sure which way it's going to go.
A couple of questions in light of the Orlando tragedy, which was called terrorism by a lot of people, but also, Jim, this notion it was a hate crime.
Oh, there is absolutely no doubt. It was a hate crime. This person who massacred 49 people lived an hour and 20 minutes away. If he wanted to commit an act of that magnitude, he didn't have to go an hour and 20 minutes away. He did not have to choose or target a gay bar. It is clearly a hate crime. I also consider it an act of domestic terrorism. That's my personal opinion. But it is no doubt a hate crime. And what concerns me is how many people in our country, people in elected positions, won't utter LGBTQ when they talk about this act, when they talk about this massacre. They pretend like it was not targeted towards our community. And to me, that is unconscionable because it was absolutely directed towards us. It was meant to shake our community, to tear our community apart, and to remind us that for so many people, we are less than. We do not matter. And I have to tell them that is not going to happen. We've been through too much. We are a strong community. We are resilient. We made it through the HIV and AIDS crisis. We have survived countless years of being treated as less than. And this act, this horrible act, isn't going to change that. It will make us stronger.
Marriage equality relied on changing hearts and minds on a beautiful life event. How do you envision our community harnessing that power for non-discrimination laws, which involve issues that not everybody can identify with, the same way they can identify with being a stranger in death, not having one of the parents listed on a birth certificate?
That is a great question. I think that is a challenge because you're absolutely right. I mean, it is all about stories. It's about making the issues real. It's taking the abstract idea, making it concrete. I mean, I can even say for John and me, when we got married, we knew Ohio wasn't going to acknowledge it. But we really didn't understand what that meant until we were in that position, and Al pulled out this blank death certificate and gave us a real, concrete, real-life impact example of what that meant. So we have our work to do. We have to figure out how to get those stories out. We have to figure out how to make those impacts real, relevant, and relatable. And until we can do that, it's going to be a more difficult process, absolutely. So we just have to keep telling stories. We have to tell stories. We have to make it real. We have to make it human.
Debbie, one of the stories that you told so richly in the book was the story of Al, a straight man with a lot of kids who, from the moment he was in college and law school, was fighting the man at so many different levels.
So true.
What is he doing now? What has motivated him?
What is he not doing now? I mean, really, Al has been 35 years fighting for civil rights. And in fact, I spoke to him the day after the decision, and I said, my goodness, you're going to be celebrating in Cincinnati and this and that. He went right back to taking depositions. He represented, it's a huge, another big national issue, are unarmed people who have been shot and killed by police, particularly young African-American men. And he went right back to representing a father, I think, of 12 who was unarmed, African-American, and shot and killed by a police officer at the University of Cincinnati. And he took that case on immediately after this one, though he did, and in fact won a huge settlement for the family. But he did celebrate at least the first day after the decision in a gay pride, not the gay pride parade, was it a gay pride parade? In Cincinnati. So he gave himself one day to celebrate, went right back to work.
Well, I think the other story about Al that I love and this was after oral arguments. He and his daughter took a, 2,200-mile bike ride from Cincinnati to Ferguson, Missouri, down to New Orleans, correct? Mm-hmm. And along the way, they stopped and worked with police organizations, community organizations. They raised money. That's just the type of man he is. He can't stop. He just can't help himself from fighting for others, for what matters, what's important for civil rights. He really is an amazing man and just worthy of our respect because of what he does.
He's a true believer, and as I've said before in DC, as you know, we need a lot of very slick lawyers, and Al is really the exact opposite. And you know, I knew very early on in writing this book that he would be a main character because he grew up on a chicken farm, got a full ride to NYU, could have gone anywhere, made all kinds of money, and wanted to go back to Ohio to represent people who were powerless and who needed a voice. And that's what he's been doing for 30-some years. I think he's one of the most compelling characters in Love Wins.
Without a doubt, and in that awful corduroy jacket, which you described. I can just see him in that terrible coat, right? It's a type. It's a fabulous type. This last question is a bit of a Molotov cocktail. Do you think you made the perfect plaintiff because John had ALS and not AIDS?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. You know, no one's asked that before, so I think it would have been vastly different if he had had AIDS, because there's still such stigma, still such, I'll just stop with that word. There's still such a stigma in our country towards people with HIV and AIDS. I think it would have been a different story, absolutely. I don't think people would, I think we would have been subjected to a lot of hate. And I'll tell you one of the best things about the almost 2 years from start to finish of our case, and this surprises a lot of people. I've been asked a lot of times, well, you must have just gotten a lot of hate. People must have just sent you things that were terrible. In the almost 2 years, I can count on one hand the pieces of mail I received that were less than supportive. 4. On the other hand, the thousands upon thousands of emails, letters, cards, and most importantly, the personal interactions I've had everywhere I go. People stop me to thank me, to shake my hand, to tell me stories, show me photos, and to explain what this fight and what marriage equality means to them or to someone they love. And it thrills me. I was so happy when people asked me that, and I can say 4. And on the other hand, that is so far outweighed by the love and the support I've experienced this entire process. To me, that says our country has changed. And that gives me hope. And the other thing that really gives me hope is whenever I talk to parents and anyone who talks to the younger generation and they talk about marriage equality, they talk about equality in general, and the younger generation just looks at them with this face of, what's the big deal? To me, we're heading in the right direction. We're getting there. And that makes me feel good, and it gives me hope.
What a great place to end. Jim, Debbie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And they're going to be signing books.